If you've ever thought, we all get on well, we'll deal with any issues if they come up, a shareholders agreement is the document that quietly prepares for the moment when that turns out not to be entirely true. Because once money, control, and differing opinions are involved, even the most straightforward relationships can become complicated, surprisingly quickly. In this video, we're going to walk through some of the must-have provisions in a shareholders agreement. Not the glamorous bits, admittedly, but the ones that can stop a business relationship from turning into a very expensive group argument. Let's start with pre-emption rights, which sound technical but are really about fairness and control. In simple terms, if a shareholder wants to sell their shares, pre-emption rights require them to offer those shares to the existing shareholders first, before going off and selling to an outsider. This prevents the slightly alarming scenario where you wake up one morning and discover your new business partner is someone you've never met and possibly wouldn't have chosen. The idea is to keep ownership within the existing group unless the shareholders agree otherwise, which is generally a good thing. Now, moving on to compulsory transfer provisions. This is where things get a little more pointed. These provisions deal with situations where a shareholder has to sell their shares, whether they like it or not. Common triggers include things like leaving or being dismissed from employment, seriously or repetitively breaching the agreement, or, in less cheerful circumstances, death or incapacity. The idea is to avoid having inactive, uncooperative, or unsuitable shareholders lingering indefinitely. It sounds harsh, but it's actually about protecting the business and the remaining shareholders from long-term complications. Of course, once it's decided that shares must be transferred, the next obvious question is, at what price? This is where valuation provisions come in, and this is an area where vague drafting can cause very precise problems. A good shareholders agreement will set out clearly how shares are to be valued. That might involve an agreed formula, a multiple of earnings, or an independent valuer. Sometimes there are different valuation bases depending on the circumstances. For example, a good leaver might get full market value for his shares, whereas a bad leaver might receive something less generous. It may feel slightly awkward to define who is good and who is bad, but it is far less awkward than arguing about it later with lawyers involved. Then we have deadlock provisions, which are particularly important where you have equal shareholders. Deadlock is exactly what it sounds like, a situation where the shareholders cannot agree and no one has a casting vote. The business is effectively stuck, like a car with two drivers and no steering wheel. A well-drafted agreement will set out what happens in that scenario. This could include escalation procedures, such as referring the issue to mediation, or more decisive mechanisms like a shotgun clause, where one shareholder offers to buy the other out at a specified price, and the recipient must either accept or buy the offerer out at the same price. It's not exactly friendly, but it does tend to get things moving by motivating shareholders to reach an agreement. Closely linked to this is the question of decision-making and voting thresholds. Company law gives us default positions like ordinary resolutions which require simple majority of votes and special resolutions which require at least 75% of votes, but these may not reflect how the shareholders actually want to run their business. A shareholders agreement allows shareholders to specify certain key decisions that require a higher level of consent, sometimes even unanimity. These might include things like issuing new shares, taking on significant debt, changing the nature of the business, or selling major assets. The point is to ensure that fundamental decisions cannot be made without broad agreement, rather than being pushed through by a simple majority while everyone else looks on in mild horror. Ultimately, a shareholders agreement is about planning for scenarios that you hope will never happen. It's much easier to agree on these provisions at the beginning when everyone is optimistic and on the same page than later on when relations may be more nuanced. And if you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who enjoys learning about how commercial lawyers prevent problems before they become expensive ones, which is exactly the kind of person this channel is for. So do give the video a like if you found it useful, subscribe for more practical insights without the unnecessary drama, and feel free to drop a comment if there's a topic you'd like covered next.